Good afternoon, Wayne. We've known each other for a number of years, and now we're Zooming together.
We are.
If you could go back to your earliest memories of a musical connection in your life, you're in California.
Well, yeah, I grew up in Downey, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, and my dad was away. He had been in World War II, but then he got pulled away in the Korean War as well. So when I was three, four, five, dad was gone a lot of the time, and I was an only child. So my mom had this great love of old movie musicals. So for your listeners who didn't exist back then, in those days, there was no home video. There were no DVDs or VHSs. You waited till one of the movies you wanted to see got shown on television, usually late night. So mom would let me stay up and watch the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers movies or the Nelson Eddy, Jeanette MacDonald movies. And
Did she take you to movie theaters also?
yes, yeah, we would go. And when Dad came back, I remember us all seeing White Christmas in the movie theater when it opened. And so, yeah, musicals were a pretty common part of American entertainment then. And all the TV variety shows sang songs from Broadway. It was a very different era than it became in the later in the 50s when rock and roll took over everything.
But did you sing along, or when they played records,
I
did you?
did. My mom played the piano and sang and all that. And but it was funny. My folks were children of the Depression, so they always thought these things were awfully nice entertainment, but not necessarily something you could make a living doing. So my dad was an attorney and my mom was a school teacher, and they hoped I would amount to something substantial, like a lawyer, perhaps. So I'm going to try something here. Can you? Oh, let me see. Screen share. Oh, will you allow me to screen share?
Sure.
You have to enable it.
Let's see. Yeah, I think there's a screen
It's at
share.
the bottom, I think.
Yes, I did. Well, I guess I need to click on share once I have that. Okay. We're both. Okay.
All right. Now this, I don't recognize this as my screen. That looks like your screen.
I'm on top and you're
Yes. Okay.
underneath me.
Host disabled participant screen sharing. So if there's a place for participant screen sharing, I'd love to share some pictures of good news and so forth with you today.
I click on you.
I'm
No.
viewing Bruce Yecko's screen. View options.
Let's see if there's anything up here. What does it say here? You are screen sharing.
Hmm.
I've clicked that. So
But maybe go over to participants or
let's see what else I have on top here. Okay, let's see.
maybe it's at the
Security.
bottom with hosting.
Well, it moves from the top to the bottom for some reason. New share. Let me click on that again and see. It says I'm screen sharing.
Well, you're sharing your screen, but we're trying to get to where you allow the participant to share their screen.
I don't really know how to do that.
Oh gosh, then this is going to be.
We just hold them up. Haven't the actual pictures.
They're not printed. They're all on a file.
Uh, Maybe you could send them to me and somebody else can figure out how to add them.
Well, there's a lot of them. Hmm.
Return to.
Bruce, will this air exactly as we are speaking it now, or
Well,
will you edit
it
it?
can be edited. Yes, yes.
Okay,
Yes,
so
edited.
we'll lose this. Me more. Uh,
Click stop screen sharing and see. I guess that'll cut.
well, we'll be back to us at that point. Hmm. Oh, what a shame. I got
It
a whole
says
lot of stuff
share,
prepared for you here.
basic. Check the window or applicant that you want to share. Maybe that basic. Let's see if you do anything. Advanced files. This is portion of screen. And that doesn't seem to do anything. Music or computer, sound only, no. Contents from width. Right. There, I'm really big, but that's good. But it's no different on your end. I'm big and you're, says we're screen sharing. Stop sharing. And we're back to you being big and my being a little picture on top. I don't know if that.
Yeah. Well, you must have something to do with host and permissions.
It just says mute, stop video, security, participants, chat, screen sharing, pause, stop recording, and what's this other?
And when you click on participants, it just lists the two of us.
Yes.
And when you check on security, what does it do?
Yeah, maybe that's something. Share screen. I think we may have discovered something. Now let me do this screen. Let's see if this does anything. No.
Yeah, viewing Bruce Yecko's screen. Okay, stop your screen sharing and see if I got permission. Up at the top, stop screen sharing.
Okay. Is it
Okay.
You see something? Okay.
I do. Can you see that?
Yeah, so we'll pick it up from here and you'll say, this is you or who is that?
Yes. First, okay, I'll back up and we can start cleaner than that. Okay.
Okay, I'll introduce you and then just do a little repeat of what we did. That would be easier if we do that. So just welcome you again. And
yeah, sure. Absolutely. Okay. Great.
Good afternoon, Wayne. I'm happy to have you join us on a Zoom. Tell us what it was like growing up in California.
Bruce, it's nice to see you. Yes, I grew up in Downey, California, which was a suburb of Los Angeles. I was an only child. My dad was a lawyer. My mom was a school teacher. Mom really loved musicals, and she would play the music from them on the piano, and she'd sing around the house. And Dad had been in World War II right before I was born. And then when I came along, he got pulled back into the Korean War. So a lot of the time, it was just Mom and me at home. And she would let me stay up late and watch the movie musicals that sometimes came on late night Los Angeles television. So I got acquainted with the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers movies and the Dick Powell, Ruby Keeler movies and the Jeanette MacDonald, Nelson Eddy movies. And this was a whole universe that Mom loved that I shared. But they were both children of the Depression and did not think this was a career for anybody to go into. So they thought I would be, something useful like a lawyer or a teacher, perhaps. And but as a kid, I started being terribly attracted to all this stuff. What about you? How early did you get an appreciation for music and theater?
Well, I liked the movie, and my father went every Saturday night. But my mother stayed home, and I told my mother, I said, Grandma can take care of me. I won't be, I wanted her to go to the movies, and I figured my turn will come. And eventually, my father reluctantly took me to his usual Saturday night, and unfortunately, it was King Kong, and I became frightened. I'd never seen anything like King Kong, and I ran up and down the aisles.
Oh
I did
dear.
not get taken again. I've told this story before, so don't get me started on my stories.
How funny.
So
Well,
did you play the piano?
no, I took a couple lessons and I could pick things out by ear, but one of my great regrets is I didn't play piano. I played the trumpet in the marching band, so I can read music, but really only on the treble clef. I don't read very well on the bass clef because trumpet doesn't have to. So, so there was a little music, but it was definitely discouraged. And yet they allowed me to go audition for the Downey Children's Theater. And one of the first things I got to do was to play the lead dwarf in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Which dwarf are you? Grumpy?
No, it would have been more like Doc, but this was a script from the 1920s that predated
No,
the
Disney,
the
but
Disney version.
but then
And around the same time, I played the littlest angel in my elementary school. And by this point, my folks thought I was just taking this way too seriously. So I didn't get to do any more shows till I went away to college. I went to UC Santa Barbara as a pre-law major. And yet, because I played trumpet in the marching band, I was able to participate in some kinds of musical. I see. I need to close these each time. Sorry, I'm learning how to do this. So the band leader at UC Santa Barbara was a fellow named Hal Brendel, and he happened to be the musical director for a downtown civic light opera in Santa Barbara. And he was about to direct the first community theater of a production of The Sound of Music, which was a pretty new show. This was 1965. And his wife, Gloria Brendel, played Liesel, even though she was a bit beyond 16. And I actually was 17 going on 18, and I had a German grandfather, and they couldn't find a Rolf. So Hal Brendel at band rehearsals said, "Do you sing? And would you come down and audition for Rolf?" So I did. And, the pickings were slim, and I got the part. And that was the first time I got to be in a musical. And that kind of set things in motion. There were theaters in town that saw me do that and asked me to do other stuff. And pretty soon I was just kind of going from show to show in town. And did the Fantastics. And this was The Roar of the Grease Paint. Can you still see that? Am I still screen sharing?
I don't see a picture yet.
Oh, okay. Here we go.
So are you getting into leads? Rolf is not.
Yes, I was never talented enough to be in the ensemble. I didn't dance. So I always did leading roles, and that was kind of a nice thing, as it turned out.
You're the boy in the Fantastics?
I was the boy in the Fantastics, and then Cocky here in Roar of the Grease Paint. He's got those great Anthony Newley songs to sing. I did Stop the World, I Want to Get Off, the other Anthony Newley show. And after that, so by the time I got out of college at UC Santa Barbara, it was time to join the Navy, which I did for 3 years as a U.S. naval officer. And when I got out of the Navy, I had gotten my equity card at the Old Globe Theater in San Diego. And I had played in an episode of the TV series MASH. And so I felt I was ready to embark on a professional career. So with resumes in hand, I started auditioning for things.
Is this just a shot of you in general?
Yeah. A headshot from about 1972 or 73, something along those lines. Around the time I auditioned for and was cast in Good News. So you'll see a poster from it on my wall behind me. Sorry, it's a little clumsy, but So this was the mid
But again,
1970s.
you're in Santa Barbara. How do you suddenly, did they come to Santa Barbara looking
Oh,
for
no, no,
you?
no. I finished Santa Barbara. That was college.
Yeah,
And
right.
then when I joined the Navy, I got stationed in San Diego. I was overseas half the time. But when I was in San Diego, they didn't care what I did with my evenings. So I started doing TV commercials and singing in nightclubs and working at the Old Globe Theater where I got my Actors Equity card. So after 3 years as a naval officer, I felt I was ready to try a career if I could. All thoughts of law school were now far gone, and I auditioned for things in Los Angeles. That's when I got the TV show MASH. And then producer Harry Rigby had a big success with No No Nanette, an old 1920s show, and it was starring Ruby Keeler and Patsy Kelly, who were vintage movie stars. And then he did Irene, which was an even older show, and he got vintage. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. No, no, Nanette was just Ruby Keeler. Patsy Kelly joined Debbie Reynolds for Irene, another old show with vintage actors. So Harry Rigby kind of thought he was on a roll, and his third show in this triumvirate would be Good News, another 1920s musical. And he got Alie Faye, who had been the number one box office person for a number of years in the early 1940s. She had begun her career at Fox Studios in the early 1930s. She had been a teenage chorus girl when she was hired for the George White scandals in New York City. And she was attractive and she sang well and she was, cute. And 20th Century Fox, in that big rush to get musical stars out to LA, bought up the whole George White scandals and moved the entire production to be filmed in Los Angeles. And at that point, the leading lady from the show got in a fight with somebody and walked off. And Alice had a little supporting role in that George White scandals. And they bumped her up to the lead for the picture. They found out she was very photogenic. And they signed her at 20th Century Fox. And she made movie after movie after movie at Fox. And in the late 30s, for the first time, she teamed up with good-looking John Payne, who had also been a Broadway performer, nice baritone, tall, good-looking guy. And he just made his way out to Hollywood, and he had done some very distinguished movies. And he and Alice ended up making 4 pictures together, including Tin Pan Alley, I think Weekend in Havana, and their big one together was Hello, Frisco, Hello. She looks just beautiful in Technicolor. So they'd made 4 pictures together. But Alice, after her film career, decided to retire in the 40s and raise a family. She married bandleader Phil Harris, and they had 2 daughters. And one day, when Alice saw the writing on the wall at 20th Century Fox that she was no longer the young and favored young star of the lot, she threw her keys to the doorman and walked out and just decided she would be Mrs. Phil Harris. And they had a radio show, and she did a lot of TV appearances. But then she retired, and she was Mrs. Phil Harris in Palm Springs, California, for a long time.
How long was it between her stopping and doing Good News?
Well, she did TV shows her radio show in the 40s and 50s, and TV shows. I saw her on a Hollywood Palace in 1968. But then this was 1973 when Harry Rigby came and said, get Ruby Keeler to talk to her and tell her how much fun she had at No No Nanette. So Ruby lived out in California, and she got together with Alice and said, I think this would be good for you to do this. Alice had never spoken lines on stage. She'd been a chorus girl in the George White scandals, never had any lines. She had certainly done some beautiful acting jobs in the pictures, but she had never been asked to learn a whole script and do it start to finish without stopping in front of a live audience. That was something completely new for her.
So movies, you film a few
You
scenes.
only film it in bits. And so she said to Harry Rigby, you know, I'd love to do this, but I would feel so much more comfortable if I had opposite me somebody I knew. And so she called up John Payne and said, they've asked me to do this, and there's a role for a football coach. And how do you feel about this? And John, as luck would have it, had had a dream the night before where he saw himself surrounded in bright, big white light, which could be being on stage.
Had
And
he
so when
done,
Alice, I'm sorry?
had he done theater?
Oh yeah, he was in the Broadway Here's Love. He'd done actually quite a lot of theater in stock and on Broadway before he started doing westerns in LA, and he had his own series, The Restless Gun. He was a multimillionaire from land holdings. He wrote screenplays under a variety of names. He didn't need to work at all, but he always liked Alice. And when she called this day after he had this dream, he thought, well, you know what, that sounds like that could be fun. So they signed on, and Good News in its original version was set in the 1920s. It opened on Broadway in 1927. It was a silly story about a college football player who's a big star, but he flunks his astrology exam and may not be allowed to play in the big game that his school, Tate, is going to play against Colton University. So there's a big push from the students to get Tom a makeup test to see if he can pass his astronomy exam and get to play in the big game. That was the plot of this show in
The professor
1927.
doesn't care about football, right?
And the professor in the original play is a man. It's a very small part. And he reluctantly agrees to let Tom take a makeup test. And Tom is going with a very rich girl who's quite the society favorite. And she suggests that her cousin Connie, who's a bookworm, might be able to tutor Tom overnight to pass the test the next day. And Connie turns out to be a girl of some substance, and Tom turns out to like her, and their romance thwarts his romance with a society girl. But he passes the test, he gets to play in the big game, and yet, if he makes the winning touchdown, he is going to have to marry this girl that he is no longer interested in because she has a promise from him. So at the last minute, he tosses the ball to his college roommate, Bobby Randall, who has never played on the game. He's been on the bench as a substitute the whole season. He tosses the ball to Bobby, who manages to get across the finish line with it. And so Bobby saves the day. He gets together with his girlfriend, Babe O'Day. Tom gets to marry Connie, and all is well. Well, when they decided to turn this into a musical revival for Broadway in the 1970s, they wanted to feature Alie Faye. Well, there's no real role for her in that original scenario. So they turned the astronomy professor into a female professor and invented a romance between her and the football coach. And they decided that they would try to beef up their roles to justify that star billing that you see on the poster. They have 100% of the title, both of them. So they would try and try and try to give Alice interesting things to do in the plot, but basically, once she agrees to give him the makeup test, which happens basically in the first scene, she doesn't really have any plot function at that point. So everything they gave Alice and John to do after that was kind of filler.
Who wrote this Broadway script?
So Harry Rigby hired Pulitzer Prize winning, Tony winning Abe Burrows to both direct the show and to adapt the old 1927 script. And they gave permission to add other songs from the De Silva, Brown, and Henderson catalog. And they would be arranged by the wonderful Hugh Martin and his new partner, Timothy Gray. And they did great vocal arrangements of these 20s songs. So Abe got to work on beefing up those two roles. There was always a sidekick for the coach, the team trainer Pooch Carney. And originally, when we went into rehearsals, Pooch Carney was to be played by Eddie Rochester Anderson from the Jack Benny Show, who had had a long, distinguished Broadway career and movie career himself. But in the 1970s, he was not in very good shape, as it turned out. And when he showed up for rehearsals, he couldn't remember anything. And it was really sad because this was a very talented man, but it clearly was not going to work very well. So we rehearsed with Alice and John and Rochester Anderson for 2 weeks, 3 weeks in New York, 4 weeks in New York. And then we headed for Boston, which was to be our first city. And
Was it
between
always going to be a long tour? Was this?
it was going to okay, here's the idea. Uh, Irene had had some financial trouble, and they all decided, the producers and whoever the powers that be, the general management, that if they had stars on this show, they could sell it at theaters around the country for a year before bringing it into New York. And by that time, it would have made so much money back that it wouldn't matter if the critics liked it or not, and it wouldn't matter if it ran for a long time because they would have made their money back on the road. And three shows decided to do that in 1973 and 1974. Good News, Carol Channing in Lorelei, a reworking of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and Yul Brynner and Joan Diener in Odyssey, a musical about Homer. And all three of those shows encountered change after change after change on the road, changes of actors, changes of directors, new costumes, new musical arrangements, throw this out, add that in. All three shows ended up limping into New York and failing at the box office, all of them having exhausted their capital on the road. And it kind of turned out that it's sort of the law about gas expanding to fill whatever space it has. If you give people 2 weeks to get a show together, they'll get it together in 2 weeks. If you give people a year to get a show
It'll
ready,
take a year, though.
and
Try
it
for a
kept
year.
changing. So after we opened in Boston, after the very first preview, cuts started putting in. But let's back up a step. So yes, it was planned to be a 7-month tour before coming into New York in the fall of 1974 was the plan. And so we rehearsed in New York, and at the last minute, they replaced Mr. Anderson with another African American comic named Timmy Rogers, who had a very cool, very 1970s style of humor. And he was very talented and funny, but he wasn't jibing very well with the material that was in the show. And they had cut so much material because Rochester Anderson wasn't remembering it, that there wasn't a whole lot for him to work with when Timmy Rogers came in. And I should also mention that because Harry Rigby, the producer, had had a big success with No No Nanette, which was set in the 1920s, they didn't want to be accused of repeating themselves. So even though Good News is the quintessential 1920s musical with a big dance number called the Varsity Drag, which is essentially a Charleston, and the whole show is about sheiks and flappers and bootleg hooch, all of those very 1920s things. When it was decided that they would star Alice and John, they decided, oh, you know what? They started working together in the 30s. So if we set Good News in the 30s, then we can't be accused of repeating ourselves in the 20s, and it'll have a certain nostalgia. And we'll just arrange the musical numbers to sound like 1930s arrangements. Well, the story doesn't really make much sense if you're in the Depression. And sheiks and flappers are really fun, whereas girls in the 30s had to wear long skirts, and bootleg hooch was no longer
Marathon.
an issue.
They had to do marathon dancing, which is not fun.
Right, right. So all of the people involved with it had their challenges trying to make this make sense in a 1930s context. Um, Abe Bros struggled. They didn't put in any period references to make it specifically 30s, but you could just tell by their demeanor and by their clothes that we were now in the 1930s. Donald Sadler, the choreographer, who had 2 Tony Awards already for No No Nanette and Wonderful Town, struggled to make the varsity drag into something like an early jitterbug. And it was certainly fun and energetic, but it already a major decision had been made which would play havoc with everything to do in the show. So let me advance a little bit here. I'll close this and go. Oh, shoot. I see this is going to be challenging, but so there's the cast of characters. I auditioned in LA where I was living. They had not been able to find somebody to play Bobby Randall, the roommate sidekick who wins the big game. And it turned out that Abe Bros really had in his mind that it should be somebody like Robert Morse. And I had played How to Succeed in Business, and I had a certain physical similarity to Bobby Morse. So when I auditioned for Harry Rigby in Los Angeles, he said, "Oh, wait till Abe Bros sees you." So they flew me back to New York for my callback. This was in the spring of 1973. And I realized that I knew a song that would be perfect for an audition for a 1920s De Silva, Brown, and Henderson musical. There was a rare song from an obscure movie. The movie is called Just Imagine, and it came out in 1930, and it's a science fiction movie musical made in 1930, imagining how wonderful the world is going to be 50 years later in 1980. And everybody has their own spaceship, and it's a really bizarre, wonderful film. If any of your viewers have a chance to see it, it's not shown very much. But it has this really silly song for the cut-up song and dance sidekick couple, and it's called Never Swat a Fly. And I realized literally on my way to the audition in Los Angeles that this would be the perfect song to sing. I had been listening to it a lot because a friend and I were writing an article about the movie for a science fiction magazine. So I'd been listening to this song a lot. So when I got to LA, I was working in San Diego. So I flew up to LA, borrowed a car, drove to my accompanist's house, and I sang the song to her on the way to the audition. And even though you're never supposed to go into an audition singing something that you're not totally familiar with, I did. And it turned out fine because Harry Rigby said, you got to sing that for Abe Burrows. So by the time I got to my callback a couple weeks later in New York, I had had the song written out and I'd practiced it.
And this song is De Silva, Brown, and Henderson?
It is. All of the songs in the revival of Good News, unlike the 1947
movie. Did they even know that was a De Silva? Did they?
They had never heard it.
No, but did they never heard it? Did they say, is this a De Silva's? Because they wouldn't want to do a song by Rudolph Fribble.
Well, I just went in with it as my audition song. But as it turned out, they loved the song. They bought the rights to the song, and the song went into the show for my character and for Babe O'Day, who was played by Barbara Lale. So my audition song actually got put into the show, at least for a while. So I think now we're caught up. So now we are, see if this is smoother. Yeah, this is smoother. So here we are. We get to Boston to start rehearsals.
So you're just in the theater there?
At the Colonial Theater, this is outside. And you'll see it lists only Alie Faye and John Payne because they were with it. And at this point, we were still working with Timmy Rogers playing the role of Pooch.
It might have been Rochester had he gotten that far.
And as it turned out, well, it was the coldest winter Boston had seen for quite a while. Uh, and oh, here we are. Here's the sign where we add Stubby K. Stubby K was in Boston playing in The Odd Couple at a dinner theater. And he had the perfect qualities for the team trainer character. So they bought him out of his dinner theater contract, and Stubby came over and started rehearsing with us. But the role was not very good by that point because it had been cut way, way down. All he had at that point was the song Keep Your Sunny Side Up in Act Two, which is not originally from Good News, but it's a De Silva Brown and Henderson song, one of the several that were put into the show. So Stubby agreed to do this, but Abe Burrows, with whom, of course, he had a track record in Guys and Dolls, Abe promised his old friend Stubby that the role would be so much better by the time it opened and that he'd have more to sing. He'd have a song in each act, and there would be really funny jokes to do. So Stubby signed on, and he was a really good sport, and he got right in, and he's a pro, and we started working, and we were all, oh, here we are. I guess that's later on in the tour. But there's our young company, Cathal and Jimmy Brennan and Tim Cassidy and Sally O'Donnell. Young, hopeful people. Almost all the young people in the show were making their Broadway debut. And it was just a time of enormous optimism and excitement that we were going to get to do this thing.
And you are optimistic? Are you optimistic that you're going to be a big
Oh my
thing on
gosh, I feel
Broadway, the
like
whole show?
I've had my dream come true. I love all those old 30s movies, and now I'm in one with Alie Faye and John Payne, and I'm going to go out and sing with a big full orchestra every night, and I have a song in each act. I have Button Up Your Overcoat in the first act and Never Swat a Fly in the second act. And look at this theater, the beautiful, beautiful colonial theater. Just truly a dream come true. I'll tell you a little quick story, though. I mean, since we're not real rushed for time on this, a measure of Alice. Alice had been really nervous throughout the rehearsals in New York because, as I said, she had never had to learn a whole show. She had never had to memorize a script, start to finish, have that much dialogue. And really, with the size of the billing, there were great expectations that she was going to be this onstage dynamo. And really, what she was famous for in her movies was being soft and vulnerable. And John Payne or Don Amici or Henry Fonda or Tyrone Power would do her wrong for a little while, and then they would learn the error of their ways. While they were gone, she would sing a big soulful ballad like You'll Never Know. And they would be reunited at the end, and it would be happy. She wasn't ever somebody who played the driving force or the villain of a piece, which in Good News was as close as we had to a villain, was the astronomy professor. So it's a 1920s show that's being done in the 1930s. Wrong. We have Alie Faye playing a role that she's not exactly suited for, and she's having trouble learning all the stuff. So she was nervous, and our stage
How
manager.
How many songs did she initially have in Boston?
Oh, she had a fair amount. She opened the show with "The Best Things in Life Are Free," and then later on she would encounter John Payne, who in this version was her old college sweetheart, and they're reunited, but on opposite sides of this issue. And they sing "You're the Cream in My Coffee." And a little bit later, she would sing the song Together. We stroll the lane together, thinking back on their romance. And then at the beginning of Act Two, she would lead the students in the Good News number. And toward the end of Act Two, she sang I Want to Be Bad, deciding she was going to cut loose and win that coach over once and for all. And then they were in the finale together. So that's how it began. So she had a fair amount to do, singing wise, but not much to do in the plot except show
She just
up. She
comes
kept
on
showing up.
stage and sings.
And she would come out usually what they call the in one scenes, because the scenes with the students really drove the story and really had all the big numbers. And so Alice and John's scenes would be in front of a backdrop while we set up for the hot shop or the football rally or something else. And then the curtains would part and all these energetic young people would do the big numbers, and then they'd close these curtains and she and John would come out and have a fight and then go off again. So it was not showing her to the best advantage. And then Stubby is there trying to make something out of every scene he's in, because he's promised that there's going to be a good part for him, but there isn't yet.
There wasn't time in Boston to give him too much.
Well, the day after we had our first preview, they cut 35 minutes out of the show. So the second performance, because it went way, 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 way long.
I was there. Are you aware that I was
the first
in the
night?
audience? Yes.
Oh my word!
So what things were cut that I saw?
The middle choruses of things, the dance that went with "Never Swat a Fly," a couple little in one scenes, and the good news number used to start with Alice in the sorority hall with all the sorority girls, and then the boys would come in. And then they would work their way downstage, and another curtain would come in, and they would all come back on stage and continue doing the number in front of this curtain, and then they would go off. Well, they figured out how to tighten it up so the whole number could happen in the sorority hall. But Alice, in 1973, when we opened this in Boston, the only microphones worn by actors were worn by John and Alice, because they were movie actors and they had, smaller voices. The rest of us sang loudly, and we faced front so we could sing down to the orchestra microphones that were across the front of the stage. And Stubby K had a microphone that was turned on just for Keep Your Sunny Side Up. But in general, it was not the world we now live in, where everything is mic'd. Nor were the microphones that small in 1973. So what they normally did was put the microphone in the bra or on a tie or on a clip somewhere on the guy or the lady, and they would run this little wire to this battery pack, which was about the size of a large cigarette case, and they would hide that on the actor somewhere, usually in the small of the back, because your natural curvature in back would kind of disguise it, and that's where most of us wore them. Well, the first time Alice's body pack was put on her, she came out in a nice slinky outfit, and Alice had a great figure, beautiful legs, ample bosom, tiny waist. She had no backside whatsoever. So when she turned sideways, she looked a little like Quasimodo with this lump on her back. So they tried putting it different places, and they ended up strapping it to the inside of her thigh, and her skirts were all below the knee, so that was really okay. But it would tend to ride up in the dance numbers. And this nice, sweet, very unassuming lady would come off stage after a number, and whoever was next to her, she'd hike up her skirt and say, "Can you fix this?" And try to get it back down in place. Well, the first night when you saw Good News, the Good News number was as I described it. It started in the sorority house, and then they left, and the curtain came in, then everybody came back out and continued. By the second night, they had figured out how to keep the number in the sorority house. So the sound man was following this list of cuts and changes that was coming at him like crazy for that first performance that was edited like this. And he thought once the number in the sorority house finished, that Alice would be coming back on stage and singing again. So he left her microphone up, because normally the number just continued. Instead, suddenly we were in the locker room, and John Payne was chewing out the football team for how badly they had done in the first half of the game. And he was trying to remember what the cuts were in his dialogue now, because he had this long monologue. And in one of those big meaty pauses, while he was trying to think what the next line, we on stage and everybody in the audience heard Alice's unmistakable voice say, "Well, I don't know, but it's dangling down there between my legs someplace." which got one of the better laughs of the evening. Unfortunately, not one we were ever able to repeat. But so that second night, lots of things were shortened. Nothing was cut altogether, but just lots of things were shortened. And
Wouldn't it have been easier to cut a little of it or not all of it, looking back?
well, this was what Abe Burrows was supposed to be a genius at. All through the rehearsals, everybody was saying, this show is long. Is
He
this going
looks
to
at a
be?
show and he'll get it in shape.
He'll get it in shape. He's a genius for this, honing it down. And and he did do a lot of cuts, but anyway, so that was the story on that.
But how many hours did you rehearse the second day to learn all this?
It's nowadays Actors Equity has very strict rules about how much you can rehearse on a day that you have a performance.
It's four to
But in
six hours. How many hours is it now?
it depends on what contract you're on. But in 1973, the touring laws, the rules for national tours were all predicated on the idea that you would rehearse out of town and maybe perform, a week in New Haven and a week or two in Boston, and then you'd come to New York. So it was all going to be a very quick process. So we did not have to have a day off for the first 4 weeks at all. And as long as we were in a pre-Broadway preview, which again, as I say, the original rules were meant for that to be a 5 or 6 week period, but we were now going to be out. It turned out for a full year. If they could work us 8 hours a day. So if we had a 3 hour show, we could work 5 hours every day. And we ended up doing that the entire year.
With
So we
no
rehearsed.
exceptions, you never Christmas or something you didn't have every day. It would seem there would be a time when let's not do that this week.
7 weeks in San Francisco. We opened there in the spring of 1975. Mac and Mabel was supposed to be playing there, and they couldn't get it together. So those 7 weeks opened up, and at that point, Good News just had a bunch of 2 week engagements scheduled in places like Cincinnati, and they were able to get out of all of those and move us for 7 weeks to San Francisco. Alice felt so at home in San Francisco, and partly from Hello Frisco, hello, but it's also a city that she'd enjoyed being in. And for the first time, the show got unanimous raves from all of the newspapers. So we rehearsed. There was we did almost a different version of the song Good News for every city. And we had 3 versions working at any one time. One that we would do in the show, one that we would do for TV studios if Alice were available, and one that we would do for TV studios if Alice weren't available. So the Good News number, they decided, needed to be a tap number. So even though this cast hadn't been auditioned for tap ability, they were going to make it a tap number. So we rehearsed that in San Francisco, but only for a little while every day. And that was the only city where the show that opened opening night in San Francisco was not changed for that whole 7 week run. Other than that, every city saw a different version of the show almost every night as they kept trying to
What
fix
number?
things
What?
not
Excuse,
simple.
excuse me. What number city was San Francisco? Approximately.
Boston, Toronto, Philadelphia, Washington, Detroit, San Francisco, Chicago, St. Louis, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York.
So I would hope that after things went well in San Francisco, that everything would be hunky dory.
You would have hoped so. You would have thought so. But the very next city, we got more of the kind of reviews that they had gotten, wondering what Stubby K was doing in the show, wondering why Alice and John weren't having more impact. There's something a little off about the show because obviously it's got a 20s mentality at heart, but it's being presented as a 1930s show. The scenery was looking beaten down. And the big thing was Stubby, understandably, had been promised a good role, so they kept trying to rewrite his part. So when we got to Chicago, Abe had given up trying to find clever things for him to do. So for one performance only, Stubby became a yo-yo expert, and every time Pooch came into a different scene, he was doing something different with the yo-yo. But Stubby didn't have time to become a yo-yo
Well, I
expert.
thought maybe this was something he was famous or could do, but
No.
no.
And then, and then it was anonymous, but we all knew it was Timothy Gray, the co-musical arranger, who came up with the idea that because the show was about an astrology test, all of the characters should be given the astrological sign of the actor playing it. So Alice was a Libra, and they threw a line. Oh, she was a Taurus, and somebody threw a line in for her. She says, "Well, I'm Professor Kenyon, and that's no bull." And I'm a Leo, and so Bobby Randall said, "And I'm not lying." And of course, this made no sense to anybody in the audience. And it extended the length of the show without giving Stubby any more laughs because he was the one that was instigating all of it. He was the person who was obsessed with astronomy in that one performance. So for this matinee in Chicago, we played this whole different version of it. And when Stubby came out for his bow at that performance, the applause noticeably dipped when he came out. So by evening, we went back to the other version of it. Um, and then they tried to put it back like it had been in San Francisco, but it just didn't feel quite right. And the cast was so beaten down. And obviously, the producers were going to listen to anybody who had a suggestion. And so when we finally got to Los Angeles and got really bad reviews there, and the Century City complex was on the same real estate that had been part of the 20th Century Fox lot where Alice had made her movies.
Uh,
So coming back to that spot, she was even more subdued than usual the night of the LA opening. And instead of the feisty gal that had been doing her show in San Francisco, she was very self-effacing, and the reviews were not kind. And so during the LA run, we were told that Abe Bros was being let go as writer and director. And they were bringing in Michael Kidd, who, of course, had created Guys and Dolls with Abe Bros. Michael Kidd came in, not as choreographer, but as director, and to rework Donald Sadler's choreography as needed
so
for the.
Donald is out of the picture?
I'm sorry?
Is Donald gone?
Not
Oh,
yet.
oh,
Donald Sadler is still there, and his assistant Arthur Faria is still around trying to protect the moves that Donald has put in place that Michael Kidd says he approves of. But Michael Kidd's main assignment, which you can understand, was to make the show viable for those three starring principals. So they brought in Gary Marshall right before his successes with Laverne and Shirley and Beyond and Pretty Woman. Gary Marshall was a TV writer in LA, and he was brought in to do a new script. So he came in, and we would rehearse his script during the daytime, but we would continue to play the show that had opened every night at the Schubert. And his script was radically different enough that some of the dancing Donald Sadler had in place didn't quite fit. And Michael Kidd wanted the whole show to be more athletic. People who know Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, created by Michael Kidd, would expect real athleticism. So Michael and his assistant, Gary Mentier, were putting more athleticism into Donald Sadler's choreography, which was very stylish and very 1930s and very elegant. And maybe Donald's wasn't completely right for Good News, but the mix of them wasn't working quite right. So anyway, this was what we were rehearsing.
is this difficult for you, the dancing that they're putting in?
Oh, well, I was a character actor singer and I can move well, but I wasn't really a dancer. So I didn't have the brunt of this. But what was hard was seeing a lot of our stuff that had been well received across the country that the young people were doing being cut out of the show. And Never Swat a Fly was cut out of the show before we played New York, to my sadness. And a lot of other things that the young people had really gotten good reviews for were being eliminated or diminished so that our three stars could be put in a better light. And that's especially now that I've been a producer for 30 years, I completely understand. So Gary did his best to write a script that matched, the skills of the people involved, but it still was always going to be a 1920s show masquerading as a 1930s show. And Alice was still going to be kind of the heavy. This is Alice in a hotel room back in Boston, Annie Kay next to her, and Sally O'Donnell LeBlond, and our stage manager, Craig Jacobs, who's a wonderful friend. And Alice, she was always gracious to us in the hotels. She was, once she started getting comfortable with people, she could actually cut loose a little bit in the hotel rooms. The audiences weren't seeing this side of her, but she was really fun. I'm there in the back. And over here, the tall boy leaning in the front is Scott Stevenson, who was playing the football hero, Tom Marlowe.
We're not seeing this.
Oh, you're not? Oh, it says I'm screen sharing.
I only see.
Okay. Sorry.
Ah.
There we go. Oh, we'll do it this way. Oh, shoot. Sorry. Can you see that?
Yes.
She's really
Tell us who all the people are.
so much fun. This is Scott Stevenson, who was the leading man, the young leading man, Tom Marlowe. This is Craig Jacobs, the stage manager. This fellow was not with us the whole tour. I don't remember who he was. This is Mazzarone, who did the hair, Jerry Mazzarone. This was one of our assistant stage managers, and that's me back there. Are you still seeing it?
I think you're talking about the next picture that we haven't seen. We're still backstage with three women.
Yes, yes. Okay, good. Annie Kay. This was in Alice's hotel room. And let's see. And this one, I just wanted to share a story real quick. So throughout my, oh right, and by now we've got Stubby K with us now. Alice, during our Boston first run, she was so nervous, understandably, and I just really didn't want to bother her. But my German grandfather had such a crush on her, and his name was Rudolf Hans Kurt Bast, and he had just grown up loving Alice in the movies. And as I mentioned, my whole family was not that keen on my going into this profession. And when we opened the show for that first preview that you saw in Boston, and it was that cold winter, and somehow during my Navy years, during my college years, I had never missed a Christmas at home. Somehow it always worked out that I was home by Christmas. And this was the first time that I was not going to be home at Christmas. And my grandfather's birthday was December 26th. So I just put a note on Alice's dressing table, and I said, would you sign this? I did it a week ahead, and I said, would you sign this for my grandfather? He is such a fan and just loves you. And she said, oh, honey, let's call him on his birthday. So on December 26th, the only phone that was available was the one right by the stage door, like you see in all the movies. And every time somebody came in and out of the stage door, the wind and the snow would blow in. And Alice, with her dressing gown wrapped around her, right before the show, we went over, and I only heard her side of it. So I called up. I called him. I got him on the phone, and I said, "Hey, Papa, happy birthday! I have somebody who wants to talk to you." And I handed the phone to her, and she did. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Rudy. Happy birthday to you. Yes, this is Alice. Yes, Alice Faye. Yes, I've heard it's your birthday, and I want you to know he's doing just great. Oh, yes, he's going to have a very nice career. Don't you worry about him at all. All right, happy birthday, darling. And listen, when I get to LA, let's go out for dinner, shall we? And uh, and they did go out for dinner. I mean, she was that kind of really gracious woman, and I would hope that she would be remembered that way. She's just terrific.
But your parents saw it in LA?
They finally saw in LA. They wouldn't come to New York. They didn't come anywhere else, but they did see it in LA. And as
Did they say that it's not as good as it might be? Do they have a little criticism?
oh, yes, you could always count on criticism.
Well, wouldn't it, honey, wouldn't it be better? Wouldn't it be better if they
You know,
put
when
that
this closed,
song back
you
for
can still
you?
get your law degree when this is over. That's every time I had a show close. It was, well, now don't you think it'd be good to go get your law degree? Let me just see if I have anything else that's fun here to share. Uh,
Did you say you had a video?
I do. I'll work up to it here. Here's this is sort of fun. This is backstage at the Schubert Theater in Chicago. It was a birthday for me and Marianne Lipson, so they had a cake for us. That's Harry Rigby, the producer. And this is when you're still seeing this?
Yes.
This is when we got to the St. Louis Muni. And for the 1 week we played at the Muni, they built all new sets. Our own scenery stayed in Chicago because it turned out we'd been a hit in Chicago. We were going to go back there for another 3 weeks. So at the Muni, which is just gigantic, and outside they build these gigantic versions of each set. There's Craig explaining to the cast that they're going to have to travel a lot further to get on and off, to get from one place to another. They're just giant versions of the same basic set designs. And Alice, Alice had one little move at the end of "I Want to Be Bad," where she would finish her song and she would like truck off stage with a nice little shimmy. And she got to the Muni and she started her exit and realized how far she had to actually go. And it turned into, but so
How did St. Louis receive you?
so we got to, oh, that's too small. Okay, I'll stop the share anyway. So we got within, so here are finally the production photos that, I hope I can make these bigger. Yeah. Oh, let's see. Oh, I have to do it smaller to, let's do this. This big sparkly silver dress was added for Alice. And people would say, how does a school teacher afford things like that? But she was the star of the show and deserved it. This is Alice singing the Good News number in the sorority club. I'm there. There's the wonderful Marty Rolfe, who was.
We're not seeing. We're not seeing these.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Let's get rid of that one. Screen share. Here's the first one with Alice in the sparkly dress and her two leading men. And this is Alice in the sorority house doing Good News. I'm there. Pom pom in hand. That's Jimmy Brennan, who went on to have a wonderful career starring in Me and My Girl on Broadway and others. Just a
It's so long 174th Street for
yes,
me.
exactly. Yes. Are you still seeing?
No, we're still on the sparkly dress.
Oh, oh, you never saw this one. Okay. I see. I have to do it with each one. Okay. Hang on. Dum, bum, ba, dum, ba, dum, bum. It's very deceptive because mine says you are screen sharing, but I'm not. Okay. You're seeing that.
Yes, yes, that's a.
Yeah, that's the sorority house with the good news
What
number.
are those
Pom
things
poms?
that the girl? Those are pom poms.
Yes.
Look,
Red
they're
and white,
odd.
the school colors. Hmm.
Who is your costume designer?
Oh, Donald Brooks.
Okay.
Very, very distinguished, Oscar nominated, possibly Oscar winner. I don't remember, but really lovely guy.
Did Carmelina that I was about him.
Oh, yes, absolutely, Carmelina. I uh, I went in for my costume fitting, being the polite boy that I am, and they had me try things on, and as I finished it, and they didn't like leave. I was like in front of people, and I was a little embarrassed, but I changed out of my clothes, and as I did, I folded up my trousers and I hung them over a chair after I was out of them before I put on the next ones. And Donald Brooks said, "Well, that's the first time anybody's ever done that in a fitting." And I thought, well, how rude are people then? This, are you seeing
We
the
were
next
still
picture?
with everybody.
No. Gosh darn it. I wish this was, oh, new share. There we go.
Uh,
That's Scott Stevenson and Marty Rolfe as Tom and Connie. She's the coach, and he's the football star who needs to pass the astronomy exam. Um, can I get a new share, please? Let's see. John giving his pep talk at halftime. David Tomei, David Fredericks, Ernie Peischer, who later became Ernie Townsend, and Terry Eno.
did they have 11 football players? I mean, they were worried that
I think we just had enough. I think we had a
they
couple
had
of performances.
the girl dressed as a football player.
No, no, we never did that. It was always guys. Oh,
I've
shoot.
seen that in my theater
Yes,
going.
yes, it's been known to happen. Let's see. And let's go for a new share down here. Where can I get a share?
Well,
The,
what were you expecting from the New York reviews? You
I'm
personally,
sorry?
what were you expecting with the reviews? Was there a fancy? I would think Harry Rigby would have had a big party.
We did have a party at Sardi's, but it really was one of those ones where once the reviews start coming out, people start leaving.
Did they read them out loud?
Oh, no, not
No.
those reviews.
Did they give a, if they had, would they have, you'll hear what the New York Times said, best show in years. That would have
Yeah, well,
happened.
yes, of course, they would have read them if they had said that. Instead, it was things like Brendan Gill in the New Yorker said, "Watching this show come to life is like watching pieces of a dead mummy tissue commingling with pieces of the living and somehow failing to breathe."
Oh, that's me.
It was rough, and for all of these young people, whose hopes had been so high, and looking forward to this, not a single Tony nomination, not for the costumes, not for the arrangements, not for any of the supporting characters. It was a cruel and unusual ending to our journey across the year.
Is Michael Kidd around doing the New York?
Michael Kidd was certainly around, and I I enjoyed him, but what we felt was that they had made the show more vulgar, and even though it was a little bit better, I think, for John and Alice than it had been, it wasn't that much. Oh, so Stubby, the final solution for Stubby, and we use that term advisedly. They finally decided that Pooch's function in the plot would be that he would have a different team mascot every scene he came into. So he would have a different animal. So he started off with a little dog, and there had always been a little dog in the show. But then in the next scene, he brought in a goat that he said, oh, I thought this might be the new Tate mascot. We need a lucky mascot. And he brought in a goat. And but the goat was eating the locker room towels. So then he brought in a skunk, but of course that scared everybody. And so at the end of Act One, at the big football rally, he brought in a llama. And that was the finale of Act One in this New York version of the show, written by Gary Marshall and directed by Michael Kidd.
So the two of them came up with these ideas, Kidd and
Yes,
Marshall.
I would have to assume so.
And how did the
And
llama
then,
go? Okay, you were there for 2 more weeks. How many? This
I'm
4
sorry?
weeks. How many weeks were you ultimately in New York?
Well, so we began previews in November. I have a good story that I want to stop since you got me on a roll here. So first we get these animals, and we get the script in Los Angeles while we're doing the old version of the show. We get the script in LA for this new version we're doing, and the new version has all of these animals, which finally culminate with a baby elephant coming to the big finale dance. So we read these in the script, and this is what we're rehearsing. And we can tell that the scenery we're working with and the way the show is laid out, the way we're physically doing the show in Los Angeles, is not going to work with this new script. So something is going to have to be added and changed. And yet our cast members are still calling the box office in New York to say, you're still selling tickets? Well, there's no way we're going to be open in 4 weeks. We were closing at the end of September or early October in LA,
So
and we
you
were
just
supposed to open.
preview. You want to preview.
We were supposed to preview in New York in October, end of October, beginning of November, and we knew this was not going to happen. Looking at what the physical requirements were going to
So you're going
be.
to have to rehearse and then start previewing.
Yes, and there's going to have to be some new scenery, and also John Payne's contract that he'd signed on because he saw a burst of light and Alie Faye called him. His year was up. This whole thing has been so extended. Instead of a 7-month tour, we'd now been on the road for a year, and John's contract was up. And he hadn't asked for much. He'd never missed a show. Neither had Alice. But he had this comfortable chair he wanted moved from city to city for his back that he could have in his dressing room. Somehow that hadn't happened. He was watching the inmates running the asylum now. And as I said, this was not a man who needed to work for an income. So he let them know a couple of months in advance that when his year was up, he would be leaving. Well, now with all these extensions, it was getting perilously close to John not being able to open the show in New York if it got delayed much longer. So they were hunting for somebody, and there weren't many leading men around of Alice's vintage, especially of anybody who had some connection with her, that John had had. And they tried to get Don Amici because he had made several pictures with her, and he does do stage work, but his management got wind of how desperate they were, and so his asking price, I guess, was just much more than they were willing to accept. So they signed Gene Nelson, who had been on Broadway in Follies and who had done movie musicals in the 50s, not the 30s and 40s,
But he hadn't been with Alice, right? There's no
and had
Alice.
never had any connection with Alice. So he started showing up in LA to rehearse this new version of the show that was going to be put in ultimately in New York, which needed some additional scenery. So we closed the show in Los Angeles, and my friend Craig Jacobs, the stage manager, stays behind at the theater to oversee the pack up of the trucks as they had done in every city. he calls me late that night, and I'm going to stay with my folks in Los Angeles for a few extra days before we fly in because the cast isn't needed, to start rehearsals again for a few days. So Craig calls and says, "This is really strange. They're not packing the trucks the way they've always packed the trucks in every other city. They're putting certain things into one truck, and it's all different." Well, wouldn't you know, on the way to the airport, one of the trucks, the one that happened to contain all the scenery we needed to replace, caught fire on the way to the airport and pulled over, and all that scenery was burned. And don't you know, that meant that the show couldn't open on schedule. And so in the next couple of days in the New York papers, there were ads that said,
Insurance could
"Not
be
a show in town. Show delayed on account of fire." And we all thought this was, and
highly.
ultimately, I think there was some legal action taken with insurance because it was highly suspicious that this provided them the convenient delay they needed
The
to.
fact that they separated the truck material.
So we began previews in New York with John finishing his contract. So John played, I want to say it was 5 weeks of previews in New York. And the previews we were doing were the old version of the show as far as his character was concerned. Or we did the old version of the show for 3 weeks, minus Never Swat a Fly and minus a couple other things. They cut I Want to Be Bad because Alice had gotten some bad reviews on it, and they put in Life is Just a Bowl of Cherries as a trio for her and Marty Rolfe and Barbara Lale. And now I can't remember, but we opened with John in previews, and then Gene Nelson took over, and it was the Gene Nelson version that was reviewed after another week of previews. And that version is the one that got such terrible reviews that the closing notice was posted immediately, and we closed 2 weeks later. So it had 16 official performances, something like 30 or 40 previews in New York, and we'd rehearsed the show for 14 months and brought the worst possible version of it into New York City, and it vanished without a trace. It opened on December 23rd or so, and then we didn't have a performance the next day on Christmas Eve, and then it closed January 4th, a couple days after New Year's, and it was like we had never been there. And we had all been part of this thing for an entire year and had never gotten to see the fruits of our labors rewarded. But it was a great learning thing, and I treasure every bit of what that was in my life. This was Barbara Lale and me doing Button Up Your Overcoat.
Did you get somebody praising you in New York?
I'm sorry?
Did you get somebody praising you in New York?
One of the most meaningful review I got actually was from the Boston Globe. Elliot Norton was called the Dean of American.
Yes, nice to be appreciated by him.
And he had reviewed the show in Boston when it first opened and had really focused on the deficiencies of the show and lumped all the young people together in a paragraph at the end that hadn't said much. And when he saw the show in New York, he praised that Alice had found more confidence, and he praised a couple of things, but felt the whole thing had become crass and misguided. And his last paragraph, he said, "But there's a young man named Wayne Bryan who manages to be both comedic without foolish, believable and appealing." And he gave me a whole paragraph, and I was just shocked, and that was very rewarding. The young people got nice reviews in New York, but the show was dismissed so roundly, and honestly, we had much less to do in the final version of the show than we had had when it began. So it wasn't entirely surprising that we were not heralded as much.
See, when I talk with people about the shows I've seen and why they didn't work or if they worked, I always said that first version in Boston could have succeeded. So they compare it to anything, sounds like it never got better.
It got much, much worse. It got briefly better when it got a little shorter, but it never got really
In
good.
Chicago, I mean, if the
All right. So
Chicago, if we gone from Chicago to New York, might that have been?
yes, if. But after Chicago came San Francisco, where everybody liked it, and then we were optimistic again. If it had come in right after San Francisco, I think there would have been a
San
great deal
Francisco,
of conflict.
I meant San Francisco, yes. So now, can you tell us about the archival recording of all the songs from Good News?
Well, here I just had some old tapes transferred and was delighted that this came out in as good shape as it did. So let's see if I can share it. Are you seeing this?
It's a Dropbox that's never going to be opened.
Here is a great show starring.
I'm sorry, can you see that?
I don't see it, just the picture hasn't shown up yet.
Okay. Oh, there's no picture yet?
No, you have to click
New share.
on the top.
New picture?
Yes.
Okay.
John Payne and Alie Faye, called Good News. Would you welcome now the young song and dance comedy team from that production, currently at the Schubert Theater, and would you welcome Wayne Bryan and Barbara Lale.
You can't get away from me, Bobby Randall.
Look, babe, what do you want with me? I'm only a substitute on the football team. I'm not handsome, and all I have is $4, and that's tied up in IOUs.
I don't want a rich man. I don't want a handsome man. I don't want a clever man.
You want me?
Right. Listen, big boy. Now that I've got you made, goodness, but I'm afraid something's gonna happen to you. Listen, big boy. You got me hooked and held. I would die if I should lose you now. Button up your overcoat when the wind is free. Take good care of yourself. You belong to me. Eat an apple every day. Get to bed by 3. Take good care of yourself. You belong to me. Be careful crossing streets. Oh, don't eat meats. Oh, cut out sweets. Oh, you'll get paid to get downtown. Keep away from Mickey Fins when you're on a spree. Take good care of yourself. You belong to me.
Well, I think you're a bit nutty, but you do have excellent taste in men. Since you're feeling so romantic, who am I to shatter your dreams? Button up your overcoat when the wind is free. Take good care of yourself. You belong to me. Take a long mercurochrome when you climb a tree. Take good care of yourself. You belong to me. Don't sit on hornets' tails, ooh, or on nails, ooh, or third rails, ooh. You get paid and ruin your dum-dum. Don't go out with college boys when you're on a spree. Take good care of yourself. You belong to me.
Was that?
Sorry.
You're not a dancing team in show business.
No, definitely
But
not.
is that the show orchestra playing? Were they?
It was his band on his set. They recorded it in the afternoon, and we went over and rehearsed it, and they recorded it, and then we sang to the track of the band, although the band was still sitting back there, but it had been pre-recorded. And as we were in the middle of the number, we realized that it had gotten recorded somehow in our energy that afternoon, telling them what the tempo was. They recorded it much faster than we did it in the show. So it was a little bit frantic, but actually the energy is kind of fun on screen. So that's our little record of what we had done. 415 performances of Button Up Your Overcoat. And I won 415 games for Tate University. But not a long Broadway run, as it turned out.
But that number pretty much stayed the same. That never changed.
It did. That was pretty much the same from the very beginning to the very end. When you saw it in Boston, there was a second verse. It had her verse and then chorus, and then Bobby had a verse and a chorus. But after that first night, my verse got cut, so it was her verse, chorus, my chorus with a dance break, and that was plenty. That's all the song needed.
Ultimately, down the line, you're going to work on another version, and you're going to rewrite the book, correct?
Yeah, we did. In 1993, we were delighted to get the chance to work. We got permission from the De Silva Brown Henderson estate, and we wrote a new version that puts it back in the 1920s. We added several songs that were cut on the road that were all De Silva Brown and Henderson. And our production premiered at the theater that I run, Music Theater Wichita, in 1993. And that version now has had over 400 productions around the US, Canada, and Great Britain. And we got a really nice cast album done of that version. And it's the one that's licensed now. So it turned out to be a very lovely thing. I felt I paid my debt back to Good News. I felt Good News took me out of Southern California, introduced me to Broadway stars, took me to New York. After Good News, I went right into a show called Rodgers and Hart that only happened because Richard Rodgers had seen me in Good News and asked for me. So it was nothing but good for me, but it was such a sad ending to such optimistic feelings about Good News when we began.
Where did you record the ultimate John Yap Good News?
The orchestra was recorded at Abbey Road, and the vocals were all recorded at the Hit Factory in New York.
Okay, is that an easy process? Having been involved with records, did that go swimmingly, the recording session? He's very good. I must say, I've been in his recording.
Yeah, we had a very good time with him. We did.
You got to sing "Never Swat a Fly." Is that correct?
Yes, when we did the show in 1993, I was too old to play Bobby Randall. But when we did the album in New York, it was 2 years after the Wichita production. And most of the young people who'd been in the Wichita production were now living and working in New York. So we were able to assemble all of our vocalists, except I played Bobby on the recording, so that that was the big frustration of the Broadway one. We were all so excited that we were going to have a cast album, a Broadway cast album. I was finally going to be on a Broadway cast album. And there was one scheduled to be done early in the tour. But when things kept changing, they said, we better wait. Lorelei recorded their cast album too early, and they had to keep fixing it as the show kept changing.
A second album. They're two Lorelei albums.
Yes,
You didn't want to have two albums.
So, and we were supposed to get one done in LA, and then we got those bad reviews, and then they said,
who would have issued that had that happened?
There was never, early on, both RCA and Columbia were attached, and Columbia had done both No No Nanette and Irene.
I think Harry would have given preference to.
So that would have probably been, but they could see the writing on the wall. They saw we were in trouble, and then after the LA reviews, and they knew we were going to completely redo the whole show for New York, they said, well, if it's a hit in New York, we'll record it. And of course it would not. So that, I think, leads to what you were starting to talk about earlier, that for collectors, there is a Broadway cast album, although you can, I think, clearly say not for sale. during the whole run of the show, I guess I can say this now. Is it 50 years later? One of the people who worked our soundboard on the run of the show, who went with us from city to city, was every bit as fascinated by the history of Broadway and by the mechanics of how shows work and why they don't work. And so the show would get recorded in every city, and we would sit up in hotel rooms and discuss what was working and what wasn't working and what arrangements had changed and what we thought ought to happen. And actually, the version of the Good News scene that opens Act Two, in the version that opened on Broadway, that scene was written by Craig Jacobs, the stage manager, and me, because they had tried so many things, and Alice was so frustrated, and they kept giving her different things to open this number with. And Craig and I came up with a funny idea, we thought, and we told it to Alice, and she liked it. And she phoned it to Abe Burrows, who was still writing it at that point. And Abe liked it. And so the next day, as we often got new script pages sent to us, the cast got new script pages for the opening of Act Two from Abe Burrows. But it was the scene that Craig and I had written that Alice dictated to Abe, that he dictated to the stage manager. So, but in our version, the show, as I say, was back to the 1920s, and we were able to put all these different 1920s songs back to their 1920s orchestrations and settings. But this album was the result of all of those archival recordings being clandestinely recorded in every city. And when the whole show was over, Harry Rigby said, "Well, I'm really sorry. We didn't get an album. I heard there might be some recordings just for the archives." I said, "Well, there might be." And he said, "I'm sure everybody involved would be very happy to have a memento of the show." So 1,000 were pressed. They were all numbered. Hilary Knight did a cover for it. I did a little essay about our adventures on the road. And because one record wasn't quite enough to get all the music, we did two, including some of the songs and bits that were cut out of town and some things in rehearsals. So this got to be quite the collector's item. They used to have a copy at Colony Records for $300 there.
And at Footlight, before I was involved in it, they too wanted big bucks.
Yeah.
I actually found a copy or two. So if this is shown on YouTube fairly soon, they can contact Footlight Records if they really want an original copy. It's numbered.
Sorry?
I said, I have one or two copies I just found. I'm actually throwing out LPs. Do you have an LP collection still?
I do.
I mean, everything, or have you pruned it?
Everything.
So you have every album you had. The first one you bought in California?
Yes.
Okay.
And the 7.5-inch tapes and the cassettes and the 45s and the 78 RPM LPs. I do.
I had some 78. So it's actually easier. There's more interest in a 78 than some, but now LPs are coming back to a certain extent. And the thing
It is funny. You know, they say everything old, new again.
They're cutting out current recordings on CD because
on LPs.
No, CDs. Every time I look, I have thousands of things, and I don't have every single item in stock. So periodically, I will go and look for something.
I see what you're saying.
Bonnie and Clyde, which is popular because of Laura Osnes.
Right, and Jeremy Jordan.
Jeremy Jordan, and is a pretty. Did you see or hear that? It's.
Oh yeah, I saw it and heard it. Sure.
Yeah. Wouldn't you keep that in print?
I have it.
Yeah, no, I'm saying, would the record company keep it in print? Because you
would they keep it in print? You mean?
You can make things inexpensive. You used to have to do 1,000, but still, I would even do 1,000 of that.
Oh yeah, now you can press on demand.
But they don't do that. They refuse. It's just a download. And young people, you dealt with. Do you want any people have been in your shows who want CDs. Now, they don't record Wichita shows, but if you did record a Wichita show, I'm guessing that a lot of people said, "No, just give me a download."
Right, right, right. Not DVDs or anything
They
more.
they need to be educated somewhere. You need when you rehearse these people, say, "No, look for a CD." CDs. So tell us about Roger and Hart, because I was kind of disappointed. So that's
Oh, it wasn't a
I,
very good show, was it? I
no,
didn't think it was very good.
did they arrange who did the arrangements? Did Luther do the
Well, Buster
arrangements?
Davis, Rogers. So Rogers and Hart was a show that opened after. Um, let's see what I've got here.
How long after Good News was?
It was the Good News closed in January of 1975, and Rogers and Hart opened in I think May of 1975. So it wasn't too long later. In the cast, Jimmy Brennan there again, I got to work with, and me, and Jim Litton, and the late David James Carroll. It was put together by Bert Shevelov, and the idea of the show was it would be a salute to the songs of Richard Rodgers and Lorenz Hart, sung by people who were not alive when they were writing. And I don't know how much appeal that would have, but there it was. I actually did the song Zip from Pal Joey in a black leather jacket. It didn't make complete sense, but it was fun to
Take
do.
off any more than the jacket?
It went down to a T-shirt that I forget. Oh, the T-shirt had "Mom" on it. Yeah, not too provocative.
And how many
And
previews and how many performances?
I think 130 performances and more previews before that. It was at the old Helen Hayes Theater, which is now buried under the rubble of the Marriott Marquis. And it was, I believe, we may be tied with the Grass Harp, but it was the last Broadway show to use no microphones whatsoever. There was no sound designer, there was no amplification, there were no floor mics, and none of us wore a body mic. And the 11-piece band, or 13, it was orchestrated by Buster Davis and his team in such a way that the human voice never competed with the instruments. So you'd sing a phrase, then the orchestra would do a fill. Then you'd sing a phrase, and they cast 12 people in the cast who all had sizable enough voices to fill that rather small Broadway house. And I loved working on the music, of course, and it was a really nice, talented cast. And Richard Rodgers was still alive in 1975, and he would come around and tell us to do things slower. He liked all the tempos really, really slow at that point in his life. But it did not end up being as memorable as we would have hoped.
There were certainly better reviews than Good News. There were
Sorry?
certainly better reviews.
It
than
got
Good
better
News.
reviews in New York. It absolutely did. Clyde
But
Barnes called
nobody
it
said this is the best. Well, what did he say?
a champagne musical, he
Okay.
said.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were you singled out?
In some reviews. But it was, again, it was a show that was designed to showcase the authors with not a whole lot of emphasis on any one person. Tova Feldscher got a lot of attention. She's
I know her.
a media magnet, and Larry Guittard from A Little Night Music was quite wonderful. And but we all got a nice share of some mention of one kind or another. I was glad to have done it. And then, interestingly, just as Good News helped get me to Rodgers and Hart, I had gotten my Actors Equity card at the Old Globe in San Diego as an actor. And then in the summer of 1976, they invited me to come back and direct Rodgers and Hart. Rodgers and Hart for the Carter Center Stage at the Old Globe in San Diego. So that was my first professional directing job. And that went well enough that I directed there for 2 more summers.
Did you think of that before they asked you? I mean, is
I
it
had directed in college a couple little things on the side, and I liked it. And I think, some people are meant to just be actors, and that's really all their mind really centers on, and they can be so wonderful. And yet I think I was always, even when I was an actor, I was always trying to send a third eye out to the balcony to look back to see how I was doing and how I fit into the big picture. I've always had an eye for the bigger picture. And that was partly why we were studying those good news recordings all the time, thinking how the show could be better and should be better. And so when you get a chance to do it yourself, and I think a lot of us become directors not because we've worked with so many inspiring people, but because we worked with a few that just couldn't figure it out. And you think, well, I know I don't know everything, but I wouldn't do that to somebody, or I wouldn't let somebody on stage look like that. Or so it comes time to put up or shut up. And now, after directing and acting kind of in equal measure around the country for a number of years, I got hired by Music Theater Wichita, first in 1986, to come direct Oklahoma with...
How long had they been in existence?
They had been in existence since 1972, the same year I got my equity card, and the year before Good News started rehearsals. So Music Theater Wichita performs in a 2,100 seat, 2,100 seat auditorium. And we always do full orchestras. And I have a little video about the theater if there's time to show that, or if you
would like to see that.
Because it will explain a lot of what happened to me after Good News. Let's show here. We'll move. No, we're going to get rid of him. We're going to get rid of that. And we're going to get rid of that. We tried to do this as a PowerPoint, but I'm just going to need a little bit more coaching before I'm good with that. But let's go to here.
How many productions are normally done?
Sorry?
How many productions are normally done? Is that the same?
5 every summer. So I've done, I'm sorry?
The same number every year from the beginning?
5 large. The first year they only did 4, but since then it's been 5 every summer since 1972. I came in 1986 as a guest director and guest choreographer, and I directed Rebecca Luker as Laurie in Oklahoma with Richard White and Lara Teeter and Alex Corey. And then New Share. And then I was invited back in.
It was guest people coming in during the early years?
I'm sorry?
Was it guest directors? It wasn't.
I was a guest director, and then I was a guest actor playing Charlie in Where's Charlie? That's what I did my first summer. And then in 1988, they lost their director and invited me to come produce, and I thought I would do it for a summer. And it's been 33 years now. And I still get to go direct other places around the country and very rarely act other places. But it's been a meaningful and amazing time for me. So with your indulgence, I'll show you what we've been up to here. Are you seeing this little...
You're seeing the title.
The boxes?
I'm not seeing the actual video of you.
Okay.
I think we're headed toward a video.
This is the best of the best of the best, right here.
There's no other place I've worked at that has this sense of community.
We move mountains in a week.
More and more now, if you live in a city and you see a musical show, chances are it came in off a truck, unloaded, entertained you, and then packed up and went on to the next city. So the various cities are all seeing the same kind of entertainment. Here in Wichita, these shows are made fresh in this building. And what our audience sees in Wichita, Kansas is uniquely put together just for them and to create jobs for the young people who are working in them. Music Theater Wichita works on about a $4.1 million budget. We make sure that we spend at least 70% of that back into the Wichita economy. We buy our steel, we buy our fabric, we hire as many local people as we can. We buy about 1,000 hotel room nights a year, and 76,000 people came downtown last year to see a Music Theater Wichita show. Many of them stayed to have dinner, to shop downtown. It's quite an economic boon to the community. Every year, Nancy Reeves and Joshua Larson and I go around the country and we look for talent. This year we saw over 1,200 people to come up with the 30 or so that'll be here for the whole summer as performers, plus the Broadway guest stars who join them in each show.
I'm Jeremy Stoll. I play the Phantom of the Opera on Broadway. Been there for 10 years, and I've taken a 2-week leave to be in 7 Brides with 7 Brothers. The schedule at Music Theater Wichita is challenging in the best way. It challenges every skill I have.
And what's your subtext for that?
I miss Gideon.
2, 3.
When we are auditioning people around the country to come here for the summer, one of the things we have to look for is quickness. They can be wonderful singers and dancers, but if they don't pick up information swiftly, this is not the right theater for them. We only have 10 days of actual rehearsal to put on each show. Once we've assembled all those people and we gather them into the mothership here at Century 2, everything happens in this building. It's all under one roof, and that's pretty phenomenal.
We've got a costume shop that's fabricating costumes, fitting things from patterns, getting them on actors, making sure they're sized right.
There's probably, I would say, 400 pieces of costuming that we are actually building here that will go into the Hunchback show. Choir robes, priest robes, pants, blouses, vests.
So we've got a carpentry shop that's building the scenery.
Is there anything at all that we're going to have to like rebuild totally from before?
We have about 65, 70 shows, sets, props, and or costumes that can be rented out to other theaters. We get about 10% of our annual budget from the rental of sets and costumes. And that has meant that the licensing houses like to give us the new shows right away, so that we can build the sets and costumes that can then enable other theaters to do shows that they couldn't do otherwise. That's how we began with the Disney Company. We created sets and costumes for Beauty and the Beast. Then the Disney people spoke to the Mamma Mia producers, so we got to be among the first in the U.S. to do Mamma Mia.
We're in this massive auditorium, and then I'm backed up by this massive orchestra.
Today in New York, the Broadway pit orchestras are being scaled smaller and smaller for financial reasons. So normally a Broadway orchestra pit now will feature 13 musicians and no more. We continue to use 23, 24, whatever the original orchestration for a show called for.
We have a full orchestra for each performance. I remember when other shows on Broadway came out that had full orchestras, that people said, oh wow, is this wonderful, a full orchestra? And I thought, no big deal, we do this all the time.
Money, 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 must be funny in a rich man's world.
Collegiate young people who work here for the summer get to know many Broadway actors who help them find agents.
All the actors they bring in from New York and the choreographers and directors, you get to learn from them and learn how different people work.
It's a massive stepping stone into doing exactly what we want to be doing with our lives, which is being actors.
The talent here is a Broadway pipeline, like nowhere else in the country. I joke with my fellow choreographers everywhere that we come here to go shopping.
Right now, we have about 40 of our young alumni performing on Broadway in shows. We have alumni like Kristen Chenoweth and Kelly O'Hara, who've gone on to very prominent careers on Broadway and in television and films and in recording, who have all given great credit to the fact that they spent their formative college summers here at Music Theater Wichita. We like to say this is where you see the Broadway stars of today and tomorrow.
Music Theater Wichita is a real training ground for the professional life. They're about teaching and instructing and letting the students know what the real world is like.
I remember so vividly the stage manager when I was an apprentice, and getting to be that person for the next generation of young technicians and stage managers has been so rewarding.
couple of years ago, we came up with the phrase we think really says who we are and what we do. And it's only 4 words. Definitely Broadway, uniquely Wichita.
Great. I mean, would you say that what you've done in Wichita is the most important thing?
Oh, sorry. It's stop, whatever you're doing. I don't know what it's doing.
The world where all the great shows live.
Would you think your legacy is that you've been in Wichita and done all this?
Well, I've lived here longer than I ended up living anywhere else. I lived in California, 20 years, and New York 10, and I've been here in Wichita 33. So I think, every show closes ultimately, but what we're able to do in Wichita is keep a legacy of love for the art and training for young people who go off. And some of my young charges have now gone off and started theaters of their own. So I would say, yeah, that's probably what my legacy would be if one's talking about legacies.
Okay, one other thing. I'm afraid I only scheduled this for 2 hours. I'm afraid.
Oh my gosh, this is so much longer than I expect. I'm
what,
sorry.
What I would like to, for selfish purposes, I would like to hear 5 or so minutes what happened with Festival, because I ultimately recorded it, but it started off as a completely different show.
Yes. Well, I was going to pull out my album, but Festival was a show that began in San Francisco without me as a sort of medieval romp with a rock score, and then the producers who had it felt it ought to be a little bit more like Pippin, so they changed the artistic team. I was brought in to direct it. This was after I had begun directing at the Old Globe, and I had finished 3 summers at the Globe. So I directed this show, Festival, in LA. It starred Gregory Harrison, who later was, quite famous for Trapper John M.D. and other TV films primarily, and some theatrical films, and Stephanie Zimbalist, who got her equity card with this, but went on to do Remington Steele, and Brian, not yet Stokes Mitchell, was in it in L.A., along with a young man named Bill Hutton, who later would be the original Joseph in Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat on Broadway. Very talented cast. I think a cast of only 11, telling the story of Aucassin and Nicolette, with a rock score by Stephen Downes. And it opened at the Las Palmas Theater in Los Angeles, and then got picked up to go to the Ford's Theater in Washington. At that point, Brian Mitchell had a TV thing that he stayed behind in LA, as did Stephanie Zimbalist. So Maureen McNamara and Michael Rupert joined us in Washington, D.C. And then it got picked up for New York City Center's smaller theater. And by that point, Trapper John M.D. was in production. So Greg Harrison left, and Michael Rupert moved up to the leading role in Festival. And then we opened downstairs at the City Center and got middling reviews, but there wasn't much. We got some really nice reviews and a couple that were not terribly helpful. The Times wasn't too bad, but the producers really didn't have a backlog of money to keep it and promote it.
But they were very wealthy people. These were very wealthy people. Roger Belind was worth $500 million.
And one of the other producers was Leslie Moonves, who later went on to great fame and infamy at CBS. And
unfortunately, when I put it out, my wife, who was soon to not be my wife, she decided to take those people who paid for the record. I mean, I've paid for almost every record I did, but that record was paid by the producers, and she took their names off. And I got a call from Roger Belind. He was concerned about Stephen Downes. I don't know what his concern. He didn't say how come my name isn't there, or good my name isn't there, but he said, please honor Stephen Downes. Is Stephen Downes still around, and has he done anything else?
He has. We didn't end on the best of terms. He has, since I became a producer, he has sent me some shows to look at. However, but
Has he had something produced somewhere else?
I'm not aware of it, and it's a shame because it was a really wonderful, very melodic score, very appealing in that late '70s, early '80s kind of theatrical rock sort of way. It was licensed by Samuel French, but Stephen and his group could never get the musical score together. I hand typed the script and sent the manuscript to Samuel French, and they accepted, and they published the script the way I typed it. But the score, which you can't sell somebody on a show if you can't show them the musical score, was just a collection of sheets. It was a show with much disarray behind the scenes, unfortunately, and Stephen opted to have one of the musicians in the pit write out the score and give it to Samuel French so that they could get their licensing money. And one day I went to Samuel French to see what it looked like, and it was just all the musical notes with no lyrics written in anywhere in the whole score. And I had spent a year of my life working on this show, and I said to them, if you want, give it to me. I will go write the lyrics in and you can fix them. And they said, if they wanted the lyrics in, they would have done it that way. I said, no, that was not what was driving them at the time. They were just anxious for a little cash payout, but that's fine. So I've never heard of it being done anywhere else ever again.
No. After we recorded it, the recording went pretty well. I've done 124 albums and no problems. But after we finished the recording, it was determined that the overture would go out to California and it would be mixed for as long as I don't know how long. I was not there. Do you know anything about that?
I do.
It is a lot of, I do love the overture, but I wouldn't have spent the money that it must have cost to work on it.
Well, the reason was, when we recorded it, there was and we did the album very quickly, and we got most of the numbers were done in 1 or 2 takes. But the opening has a very evocative, soft section in the middle of it. And the first take they did of it was really aggressive, and they just drove through, and it did not set up the storytelling aspect with Michael Rupert's vocal. And he did it in the show so beautifully. So we did a second take with that in mind. And the second take was just lovely. And so we got everything we needed. But when the first mix was done, that wasn't the take that was used. And I was insistent that that was not acceptable. So it was me.
So that was done in California. Were you at the remix of it?
No, I wasn't at the mix or the remix, but, you know what? I don't remember now. That's so long ago. I don't know. 1980.
I mean, it is a fun thing, and it's a shame that it can't be done, because I would think that a Godspell kind of a group could be able
It is, and yet there was something fairly misogynistic in some of the writing, and that I don't think would play very well today. We worked against it, but I think in today's market, you wouldn't let a leading lady say, "Oh, let him love you." I don't think that would fly today, and for very good reason.
Right.
Bruce, this has been so much fun to talk to you. Thanks for thinking of me for this.
Okay, well, I'm glad you did it, and good luck. You'll be coming back in Wichita, hopefully next season.
In time for our first show in April, you bet.
Great. Thank you again.
Well, thank you. Send me a link.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
End meeting.